Hey everybody, Rock Guy here with our first video of 2022. We're going to be doing a different video today, an album rankings for my favorite bands, Stone Temple Pilots. Stone Temple Pilots, 90s rockers, grunge and post-grunge pioneers, rock band. Honestly, I'm glad that STP has been seen in recent history with a more positive light. Especially early on, time wasn't so kind to STP. They received a lot of criticism. I've been about a fan of the band for 10 years as of 2012, going into 2022. So it seemed appropriate to make this video. Just pay homage to a band that has been extremely influential to me with my favorite singer of all time, Scott Weiland. It should be noted that for this video, I will only be talking about the Scott Weiland albums. I love the Jeff Gu era of STP. Perdida and Butterfly mean to me what albums like Number 4 and Tiny Music were to STP fans in the 90s. These albums have played a significant role in my personal life. Both albums have defined moments, very pivotal moments of my life, significant changes, relationships, etc. The reason I'm not talking about them in this video isn't because I don't think highly of them, but rather because I think they should be looked at on their own, in terms of their own merits. I think Stone Temple Pilots is one of those bands where if you change one member, you pretty much change everything about the band. And who they are with Jeff Gu is different from who they are with Scott Weiland. God willing, they'll put out at least 2 more albums with Jeff Gu, so I could do a ranking video for that era of STP. But for today's video, we'll only be talking about the Scott Weiland era. If you're curious as to where I would put the Jeff Gu albums, it would be Perdida, Butterfly, and then pretty much every STP album after that. These albums are very important to me. I know a lot of STP fans disregard them or don't really get a lot out of them, and I think that's unfortunate because Jeff Gu is very talented, and in many ways I think he captures the best moments of both Scott Weiland and Chester Bennington as a vocalist. I also won't be including High Rise in this list for pretty much the same reasons I mentioned as far as the Jeff Gu albums go. Now we will only be discussing the Scott Weiland era of STP. As stated earlier, I love STP, so honestly, I get something out of all 6 of these albums. Each one means a lot to me, and I'm pretty much down to listen to them whenever. However, I do revisit some more than others. We're honestly kind of playing the favorite kid thing here. It's not really that I think any of them are better than one another. I just appreciate them all in their own ways, really. However, needless to say, some do speak to me a little bit more than others. So without further ado, let's begin with album number 6. Rounding out the bottom of our list is the 2010 self-titled album, the last album STP did with Scott Weiland. And really the last album they did for a while before they actually found solid ground again. They never really did bounce back after this for quite some time. Yeah, this was actually my first exposure to Stone Temple Pilots. I actually heard this album this album came out when I was 15 and I was really all about Korn at the time. So I never really acknowledged it. I wasn't the biggest fan of Between the Lines. It wasn't until about 2 years after this album had already been out that I actually did revisit it as I was exploring STP. At the time, it was my least favorite Stone Temple Pilots album, and that has pretty much stayed for today. And the biggest reason as to why it is because it's very unfocused. It's not a bad album by any means. In fact, it's actually extremely interesting. If you're someone that knew nothing of Stone Temple Pilots and this was your introduction to them, I think you actually might get a lot out of this because the band explores so many different sounds within this one album. I mean, there's a song on here that sounds like an Aerosmith track. There's one that sounds like a David Bowie song. There's a couple that sound like punk songs. There's some that sound like classic rock tracks. However, despite that versatility, or maybe because of that versatility, the album remains unfocused. It still feels like a Stone Temple Pilots album, but it's more of a Stone Temple Pilots album paying homage to the bands that inspired the band, as opposed to them taking that own sound and rebranding it in their own ways. For that reason, I do consider it to be the most derivative album within their discography. And another thing about this album, or maybe another appropriate metaphor, is it feels like an album that doesn't really have that spark anymore. Which really comes as no surprise because Scott Weiland recorded his vocal tracks in one place and the DeLeos and Eric Kretz made the music in another. But a good metaphor for this album is it's like a married couple who, they don't hate each other. They're still together. You see them when you go out. You see them, they're pretty still consistent in public. but they don't have that spark anymore. That love has long dissipated, and they're kind of just going through the motions. I think the best evidence in case for this point is the albums that they made after this. After this album, Scott Weiland would make Blaster with the Wildabouts, which was Scott Weiland, a new guitarist, a new drummer, and a new bassist. And then the DeLeos would make Butterfly. Well, it's literally Stone Temple Pilots, just with Jeff Goot. And both Butterfly and Blaster have so much more love to them, so much more creativity, so much excitement and passion. Nothing on Peace really comes close to what these two albums accomplished, in my opinion. Also, as a swan song for the Scott Weiland era, I don't really think this is a good album to end on. It's actually kind of anticlimactic. I think Shangri-La-Di-Da ended the initial run of Stone Temple Pilots better than Self-Titled did. Mainly because this album doesn't really have a lot of love put into it. It's good, but Robert DeLeo has since said that he hopes he never makes an album like this ever again. I think not using Brendan O'Brien was a bad idea, because Scott Weiland didn't have faith in the DeLeos as producers, which led to him half-assing it as much as he has. In spite of that, I do think the album is very good. I don't dislike it by any means. My favorite song on the album is definitely Take a Load Off, which is just classic Stone Temple Pilots, and definitely the highlight of the album. However, Fast As I Can is a pretty cool track. It's a good rock song. Bagman and Huckleberry Crumble in particular also really show off the band's range for classic rock, 70s era rock, with Huckleberry Crumble being that Aerosmith reference I made earlier. First Kiss on Mars is a very beautiful track. That's definitely a homage to David Bowie. And Mavor's nice. I don't think it's the best conclusion to the era of Stone Temple Pilots or the original lineup of Stone Temple Pilots, but it's a pretty good country song and I do get something out of it. Even though this album might be interesting to view as someone who's never listened to STP, by no means would I ever use this as someone's introduction to Stone Temple Pilots. Overall, I think this is an interesting album to listen to when compared to Blaster and Butterfly, because you see how different it is making music with someone you really want to make music with, as opposed to making music with someone you feel like you have to make music with. And it's interesting to compare the three albums to each other. Overall, it's very good, but STP is definitely much better than this, and that's why it's at number 6 on my list. At the number 5 spot is easily the most controversial choice on my list. We have Tiny Music, Songs from the Vatican Gift Shop. Now, to many people, this is Stone Temple Pilots' best album, and it's not hard to see why. Outside of maybe Pearl Jam and probably Smashing Pumpkins, no other mainstream grunge band at the time was making music like this. It was so left field for what was coming out at the time that it really deserves all the recognition it gets. Tiny Music is a homage to the glam rock era of the 70s and the psychedelic era of the 60s. This album borrows a lot from artists like David Bowie in particular, but there's definitely this overall old school tribute to the album. And it's STP taking what inspired them and putting their stamp on it, giving it STP's identity, which is more than I can say for Peace, which really just feels like STP cosplaying as the bands that inspired them. However, because of that, it still kind of ranks pretty low to me. By no means is the album derivative of anything that came out at the time, but in the grand scheme of music, it does feel kind of redundant. And being that Scott Weiland had a lot of issues with his drug addiction at the time, there really isn't a lot of music on this record. There's only 10 songs if you think about it. And there's one B-side that wasn't added to it called Kretz's acoustic song. And it's an instrumental interlude. It's really nothing new compared to songs like Daisy or Press Play, but I still think they should have included it. One, because it shows off Eric Kretz's writing range. It would have been a nice intro to Trippin' on a Hole in a Paper Heart. And two, because the album's already short enough as it is. One thing I do like about this album is lyrically it tackles a lot of what Scott was dealing with as far as not just his drug addiction, but acclimating to his life as a rock star. With songs like Pops Love Suicide, Tumble in the Rough, Big Bang Baby, and Ride the Cliche in particular addressing the issues that come with fame. And songs like Adhesive and So I Know addressing maybe some of the more personal issues he was dealing with at the time. Another thing I like about Tiny Music is it's an interesting album to listen to compared to the side project the DeLeos made at the time, which was Talk Show with Dave Coots. I feel like when I started looking at the album through this lens, it gave me a deeper appreciation of it. It also really, it's interesting because you get a what if scenario with the band. You see what they would have sounded like with Dave Coots and what they would have sounded like with Scott Weiland, making very similar music to both singers. And this interchangeable aspect was something even the DeLeos acknowledged, with, I believe, Rob DeLeo saying Big Bang Baby could have easily been a talk show song, and Everybody Loves My Car could have easily been a Tiny Music song. So that's pretty cool, honestly. It's like Tiny Music has a brother album, and that's something that I've come to recognize later in my time growing as a Stone Temple Pilots fan. Especially because for many years, Talk Show was my least favorite album the DeLeos did without Scott Weiland. That's no longer the case anymore. I have a newer appreciation of it. And that's something I've just discovered maybe last year when I was revisiting Tiny Music. Overall though, I do think Stone Temple Pilots got a little bit better. Or I even think the music they made before and some of the music they made after was better at rebranding some of the songs that inspired them than what they did on Tiny Music. Overall, it's a very good album. I think if you're someone that underestimated STP or you don't really think highly of them, then this is probably the best introduction you can get for Stone Temple Pilots, because it shows they're more than just another post-grunge band or another grunge band. It shows they have a lot more to offer. They have a lot more range, versatility, and skill. It's just, for me personally, like I said earlier, the music they made before and some of the music they made after just spoke to me on a deeper level. And that's why it's at number 5 on my list. And at our number 4 spot, we have Shangri-La-Di-Da, which is easily the strangest album Stone Temple Pilots has ever made. Dean DeLeo once said that you can judge a band truly for who they are if they retain the same original lineup into their 5th album. Generally speaking, I think that's true even without the lineup trait. I think by a band's 5th album, you can really get a gauge of what their sound is and who they are as a band. And this is very much evident with Shangri-La-Di-Da. Shangri-La-Di-Da really has everything that encapsulates Stone Temple Pilots. We've got ridiculously heavy hard rock songs with Dumb Love, Coma, Hollywood Bitch. We have their more somber, gentle moments with songs like A Song for Sleeping, Hello It's Late, Wonderful. And then we have really weird songs that are off the wall, like Regeneration, Long Way Home, Transmissions from a Lonely Room, and Bipolar Bear. Lastly, we even have a couple pop songs, like some songs that are just fun to sing along to, like Days of the Week and Too Cool Queenie. But overall, this album captures basically everything that is STP into one record. And I would describe it as insane. And the reason I would describe it as insane is because it's really just off the walls, but at the same time, it's very cohesive. It flows from beginning to end. And you wouldn't think so with how many genre steps this album takes, but it actually does flow very nicely from one song to the next. I listened to Shangri-La-Di-Da in 2021 in honor of its 20th anniversary. And I gotta say, as far as an album that transcends into my personal life, this one does really well, because upon listening to that album at that specific time, it really reflected a lot of the insanity and changes I was dealing with in that summer of 2021. However, instead of worsening it or making me feel more unstable, it gave me solid ground. It gave me security and made me feel like I was on the right path. I know initially Shangri-La-Di-Da was supposed to be a double album, and I do think it's pretty unfortunate that that didn't come into fruition, because this album is so weird that I would have wanted actually more of it. I wanted to see what other routes it would have explored. Even the weaker moments would have been strengthened by it being a longer album. Yeah, I love the album either way, but I know the only B-sides off of it are Samba Nova and About a Fool, which show off STP's more gentler range like I referenced earlier. But I would have been curious to see if they had more rock songs that they didn't include on this. More pop songs and just more weird songs that make no sense. Overall, if I had to pick any record that defined who STP is as a band, I would say it's this one. Honestly, I would almost even say that the impact of Shangri-La-Di-Da was lessened by STP making self-titled, or by making Peace, because I think A Long Way Home ends STP's career on a more appropriate note than the self-titled album did. Overall, I think this is a very weird album. I think it was a good swan song. Despite how bizarre it is, I do love this record, and it's something I always get a lot out of each time I listen to it. At our number 3 spot, we have Purple. I've always seen the Stone Temple Pilots as a bit of a Gemini band, in that they have two sides to them. One side is their hard rock side, which is something we're about to explore very soon. And the other side is their just more alternative side, the more experimental art rock and avant-garde side. And I would say Purple really captures all of that in one album very, very nicely. It's not hard to see why most people consider this to be Stone Temple Pilots' best record also. Because while it does maintain those weird moments and those art rock moments of Tiny Music and Shangri-La-Di-Da, it does have a lot more accessibility and it's much more relatable. Songs like Interstate Love Song and Big Empty are something really any rock fan could appreciate, no matter what era of rock you're a fan of. They just have that universal appeal. However, you do get glimpses of what would later define STP as far as their more experimental stuff with songs like Vaseline, Army Ants, Kitchenware and Candy Bars. Overall, I think it's a very, very beautiful album. I would say this one album defines who STP is and what they would grow into on albums like Tiny Music, Shangri-La-Di-Da, and even Self-Titled. And it's important to note that this aspect even transcended Stone Temple Pilots with albums like Talk Show, Army of Anyone, and the Jeff Good albums seemingly picking up where Purple left off, or even Tiny Music left off, as opposed to, say, Core in number 4. This album is really good for the DeLeos as far as their songwriting goes because it gave them a new face. In many ways, the backlash STP received after Core was good for them because it forced them to write Purple. It forced them to redefine who they were and what they really wanted to do. And in doing so, it gave them a new path altogether. One that most people recognize more so as Stone Temple Pilots than, an album like Core did. And for that reason, it's my third favorite album in STP's discography. And at our number 2 spot, we have the album number 4. Honestly, this album is so close to being my favorite Stone Temple Pilots record. I would say it barely loses by an inch to Core. Really, number 4 has those elements Shangri-La-Di-Da has also. There's a little bit of everything that defines Stone Temple Pilots on number 4. However, unlike Shangri-La-Di-Da, which is more balanced and consistent throughout, number 4 is a lot more top-heavy. What I mean by that is a lot of the side falls more so on the hard rock aspect of the album. This is a very, very good hard rock album. It's perfect for working out to, honestly. Songs like Down, Heaven and Hot Rods, Pruno, Sex and Violence, and MC5, they go as hard as really any harder rock band of the 90s, or even some of the stronger post-grunge bands of the 2000s. I mean, No Way Out, like every member of STP is firing on all cylinders on No Way Out. It's that good of a song. And this heavy aspect even transcends to the more experimental songs on the album, with songs like Church on Tuesday and Glide being some of STP's weirder songs, but they're still very aggressive. They're still much more oriented towards hard rock music. However, for the more experimental side, STP really excels there as well, with I Got You being one of my favorite songs because of the bass solo it retains. And of course, Sour Girl, which is probably Stone Temple Pilots' most successful single ever, being a nice pop hook that has the universality of anyone who's ever been through a major breakup.
Your wife divorced you.
Especially if you were the one responsible for it. I think that's what Sour Girl conveys, and it does so well. What's interesting about this album is it also retains some of the insanity Shangri-La-Di-Da had, because around this time Scott Weiland either just got out or he just got sent to prison regarding his drug addictions. And he also went through his first divorce, something he acknowledges in what I consider to be the greatest Stone Temple Pilots song of all time, Atlanta. Atlanta is beautiful, and it's something I would send to someone who regards Scott Weiland as, or even Stone Temple Pilots as just trend hoppers, because this proves the band has so much more to offer. The album, Atlanta, is this Latin-inspired masterpiece, and it concludes the album in such a beautiful way. To date, this is still my favorite Stone Temple Pilots closer, and it's such a beautiful tribute to a fallen relationship. Had Atlanta been released as a single, it would probably be one of STP's biggest songs ever. Since Scott Weiland died, it's gotten more popular, but for many years, I would even say it was a hidden gem. Like, a lot of people, at least the casual rock fan, never really knew about it, and that's a shame because I do consider it to be STP's greatest song of all time. If I had to pick any reason why number 4 is not my favorite Stone Temple Pilots album, it would probably be because I think it's just a little too short. I think had they included maybe one more song, it would probably be my number 1 Stone Temple Pilots album. However, I'd rather take the 11 great tracks I have than have an album with 11 great songs and one that I think should have been left off of the album. So overall, I guess it's just an album I have to be grateful for. If you're a fan of bands like Alice in Chains, or even if you don't really like grunge, but you lean more towards post-grunge or harder rock music, then number 4 is for you. And I really do think you should check it out. You'd get a lot out of it. It's a solid brutal, in your face hard rock album, and I just love it. So check it out. And at the number 1 spot on our list, we have Core. If you could do the process of elimination, you probably saw this coming. This is probably a more unpopular opinion amongst Stone Temple Pilots fans, because with most STP fans I meet, their favorite aspect of STP tends to be that experimental side I referenced earlier. Purple, Tiny Music, Shangri-La. I know a lot of STP fans who completely disregard Core in number 4, and they see it as really the band just kind of pandering to a mainstream crowd. I think even the DeLeos themselves kind of see hard rock in that way, because they've never really made a rock album away from Scott Weiland. Sure, some Army of Anyone songs go pretty hard, and I guess some of Butterfly is kind of hard rock, but not really. The last hard rock song they made was All in the Suit That You Wear, which was initially supposed to be on an album that was going to be a sequel to Core. So like I said, I think it's strange that the DeLeos have really neglected this sound overall, except on albums like Core and number 4, because they're so good at it. And while I will admit that albums like Purple, Tiny Music, and Shangri-La show off STP's more original aspect, I think Core and number 4 are just as good. Core, to me, is like, it's like sweet tea or root beer. Like, everybody in the world has their own sweet tea or root beer, but some people make it really good. And that's how I see this hard rock aspect of the DeLeo sound with Core. Core definitely captures a place in time the most out of any STP record, as it fits nicely alongside albums like Dirt, Super Unknown, 10, and Nevermind. However, I do think STP, despite all the accusations of being derivative and trend hopping, I do think STP really came into their own on this record, straight out of the gate. And I never really got a lot of the criticisms that Stone Temple Pilots were trend hopping, because songs like Wicked Garden, Only Dying, Naked Sunday, and Where the River Goes were written before Pearl Jam was even a band. Scott Weiland was pretty established in San Diego for some time. Which brings me to my next point. Lyrically, Core is a fantastic album. I think Scott Weiland explores a lot of issues that were very prevalent and important to grunge at the time. The most notable example being Sex Type Thing, a song addressing toxic masculinity. In the decade prior, you had bands basically writing music about just objectifying women, looking at women as a piece of tail or just a means to an end, literally. Sex Type Thing takes that trope and flips it on its head, and it does so in a way that's so convincing. A lot of people thought Stone Temple Pilots were just a grunge version of those 80s bands that objectified women. Since then, Sex Type Thing has been seen as an important piece of culture, but at the time, that wasn't even how it was perceived. And I guess you could apply that to Stone Temple Pilots' career as well, because people just wrote off STP as another grunge ripoff, like some sick hybrid between Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam. Plush is an amazing song, honestly. That's like definitely one of the 10 best songs of the 90s. And it's a very important song to me. It's played a pivotal role in many aspects of my personal life. There's a lot of memories I have associated with Plush throughout the years, since I first heard it in 2010, and since it became so important to me in 2012. Creep is very good as well. It shows off how the acoustic guitar blends in so naturally with a lot of these bands, being that it could have easily been written by Days of the New or Alice in Chains. And lyrically, it also applies to both of those bands as well. It shows how universal the aspect of loneliness and isolation is. Dead and Bloated, Piece of Pie, Cracker Man, Naked Sunday, Sin. It's just such a good album to listen to, especially when you need to blow off some steam. The only weak moment of the album is probably Where the River Goes for me. And it's not even really a bad song, but I do think it's a little anticlimactic compared to everything that precedes it. Like, the album maintains this energy throughout, and Where the River Goes is just kind of there and droning on. But by no means does it detract from the album for me. Core is my favorite hard rock album of all time. And I would say it set the rubric for many other bands later down the line. And maybe sacrilege to compare this band to Stone Temple Pilots, but Puddle of Mud's Come Clean reminds me a lot of Core, and it shows Core's influence throughout the years, really. Come Clean follows a very similar formula to Core from beginning to end. To date, it's the only Puddle of Mud album I like, and once I recognize that comparison to Core, I have a deeper appreciation for it. I actually like listening to both albums side by side if I'm driving, because of the similarities between each other. And like I said, those similarities aren't ripping off the band, it's just paying homage. And that's a testament to how big of a deal Core was. I think the DeLeos really neglected this side of their songwriting for many years, because the only time they ever went this hard again was on number 4 and on the one-off single, All in the Suit That You Wear. Being that their new singer used to be a new metal frontman, I would like for them to write a heavier album on their next record. Something more in line with the harder material they have made, something like Core, especially since they've been revisiting a lot of ideas they wanted to do with Scott but were unable to do because of his addiction. Now they're revisiting those ideas with Jeff. That's what led to the birth of Perdida, actually. They wanted to make an acoustic album with Scott, but they never got around to it, so they did it with Jeff. And I'm hoping now they can make that sequel to Core that they were planning to do. Because way back in the day, the DeLeos said they wanted to write a follow-up to Core, like a legit sequel. And because the band broke up after Shangri-La-Di-Da, it never happened. The only song from that session was All in the Suit That You Wear. Core is a beautiful album. It's a great record. It's an amazing hard rock album, and it's one of the best albums to come out of the 90s. And really just one of the best hard rock albums ever. It's my favorite Stone Temple Pilots album. It means just as much to me today as it did when it came out. And if you never heard it, this actually might be the best place to start as far as Stone Temple Pilots goes. Just start from the top. You'll get a lot out of it. So that's my ranking for the 6 Stone Temple Pilots albums with Scott Weiland. Like I said, I hope with the Jeff Good era, they can at least do 2 more albums, because I'd like to do a ranking for the Jeff Good era as well. What's your ranking of Scott Weiland's or STP's discography? Do you think I was wrong to not include the Jeff Good albums in this list? Where do you place those albums? How does your list compare to mine? What's your favorite STP album? Let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, be calm, be cool, be collected, and we'll see you later.